All right. Let's hope I grab the right clicker. There's two of them up here. So thank you so much for the introduction and to the organizers for the invitation to speak this morning. And thanks to all of you for traveling here and for your engagement this morning. I also want to thank the Indigenous peoples of St. Louis for whose land this convention center was built upon for their ongoing hospitality and grace amidst indifference and erasure. A couple of accessibility notes for my talk this morning. I'm wearing a black top with polka dots and brown pants in case you can't see me. There's a PDF of these slides at this URL, tiny URL /SIGCSE 26 Keynote. And you can see captions on the bottom of the slides as well right here. And then two disclaimers, some interesting disclaimers for this one. I made this talk to destabilize and to question what we do here in this community. And so if that's not what you need right now, you can feel free to take a nap, be on your smartphone, go out and get some coffee or some water. But if you aren't sure, I hope that you will listen closely and actively so that we can talk about it later in the hallways between sessions. Finally, you might notice throughout this talk that I've illustrated most of my slides. And so first, apologies for my very low quality illustration skills. Second, I'm very confident that all of the illustrations that I've made of some of the wonderful colleagues that I'm going to feature in this talk, that I have not captured your full glory with my illustrations. So my drawings come from a place of love. We'll talk about them later. All right, so I would love to talk today about all of the exciting things that we are working on in the Center for Learning, Computing, and Imagination at the University of Washington. Educational justice in programming language design, computer science learning in refugee support agencies, the technologies that were needed for highly multilingual computer science classrooms, the communities that CS teachers need to thrive, and the way that queer and trans teens are building cultures of resistance around artificial intelligence in their computer science learning. Problem is, there are dark clouds over our heads, and it's a cloud of hate and cruelty and violence in this country, and in particular, this state of Missouri. Our leaders argue so many horrible things: that people should be divided, mistrustful, and ignorant, that we should retrofit society around bullshit machines trained on stolen archives of human expression, much of which traces a history of oppression, that white Western men should dominate and subjugate people based on race, gender, creed, and belief, that human progress be dictated by power and religion, not by science, engineering, arts, humanities, or the institutions that support them, that many of us are part of, that the bodies of women, children, and trans people should be controlled by the government, that trans and queer people should be stigmatized, erased, and excluded from society, and that people with disabilities should be ejected from work, healthcare, and education in the name of fairness, and that genocide is justified in the name of vengeance. And that this fragile earth that we all call home should be mined and paved into a place to survive rather than thrive. So I mentioned these dark clouds as a reminder that many of the people in this room, including myself, are in distress or in active resistance, and that our experiences in this community are just a small glimpse of the far greater harm that's happening in this city, in this state, in this country, and in this world. And yet, while there is so much more I could say about all of those horrible things, and while our ability to understand what is broken is central to fixing it, we also have to talk about the world that we want to build together. And so that's what I'd like to do today, is at least for our corner of computing education and the many impacts that we have on the broader world, what is it that we want? So in that spirit, I want to ask, what should computing education be if not hateful, cruel, and destructive? What values should we center in education, if not division and domination? How can we focus our attention on those values in our work? What kinds of systems of learning and education do we need to enable those values? And how might those systems play a part in moving us past this broader era of hate? There are many answers to these questions already. I've spent the past 5 years arguing for critical consciousness in computing, amplifying the ideas of critical pedagogy from Paulo Freire, Bell Hooks, and others. In a recent piece, Alexander Hall and Brent Steele argued for joy as a kind of subversive form of pedagogical defiance. Through joy that centers embodiment in public spaces and relationality. And art education researchers such as Alexander Hall and Brent Steele, they've argued for a kind of radical space of learning that centers worlds that entangle noise and chaos and resistance as a resistance to compliance and convention. So I want to build on these arguments today and suggest that at the heart of these ideas is a very particular kind of love that we rarely talk about in education, and in computing education in particular. So first, I want to say, when I say love, you're probably thinking everything this pink heart represents, right? We have a lot of connotations around what this symbol means. And so I want to be clear, I'm not talking about romantic love. I'm not talking about sexual love. Take those, set them aside. They are not part of our conversation today. Rather, I am talking about the kind of love that shows up when somebody truly cares for someone and about someone. A kind of love that great teachers give students in supporting their security, their transformation, their growth. The kind of love that focuses teaching on meeting students where they are at and with what they need. I want to talk about this love and how we might center it not only in our teaching and research, but in our defense of schools and higher education from the US government and the world we need to build from the rubble of our institutions as they decay. So I will share my thoughts in 5 parts. I'm going to start by talking about my own experiences with love in computing education, not because I think that they're the right way of going about things, but just because, as I've reflected on my experiences, I think that they are privileged and unique, let's say. I'll then talk about the nature of love and its complicated relationship with teacher and learning. And then I want to unpack love's fraught relationship with computing and its ideas and computing education about them. In part 4, I will then share several examples of how to center love in computing education practice and research from other wonderful people in our community that I want to elevate, giving us a path forward towards healing our part of this broken world. And then I will call with a call to action for each of you, hopefully giving you a frame in which to think about this conference for the rest of this week, but also the broader world and our role in that world. So I will start with my own biography of love in computer science learning. I will say that I did not grow up with a lot of love in my life. My parents took care of me and my brother materially, but they didn't know how to love me emotionally. In my large extended family, death was normal. There was breast cancer, bone cancer, brain cancer, leukemia, suicide, car accidents, asphyxiation, diabetes, heart disease. In my 99% white Christian suburb of Portland, Oregon, I was frequently bullied in school for my race and my gender expression, called brownie and chink, sissy, pussy, and the F word, and regularly assaulted, shoved into lockers, kicked and punched. My friends were as well, some of them permanently injured from schoolyard violence. And after my parents divorced in primary school, we were poor, and my brother and I were homeless part-time with my father. I lived a nomadic life between my parents' homes. And across all of that, as a deeply closeted transgender girl, I could not imagine loving myself, let alone anyone else loving me. I believed that there was something wrong with me and spent most of my adolescence and young adulthood creating an elaborate persona to try to survive a world of homophobia, transphobia, and loss. And yet, despite all of this, all of the love that I experienced was abundant in one place in my life. And that was learning, and in particular, learning about computing. So here's many versions of me staring at this wonderful computer screen with a heart in the center of it. Computers kept me alive and gave me refuge. Over time, they also gave me purpose. But it wasn't computers alone, or even computers especially, that led to that love. It was fundamentally the people in my life who loved me in that learning and embraced my fascination with computers that allowed for that love to be possible. So I want to share a few stories to illustrate. So this is Mr. Hart and his mullet and 3 Roman numerals. He was my 3rd grade teacher in 1988. He was an artist first and a teacher second. It was his first year of teaching and also his last because of the way that he taught. One of his jobs was to teach us multiplication. Rather than giving us tables to memorize, he took us back to Roman civilization and its numerals. We simulated marketplaces in the classroom, making art for each other and selling it to each other on the open marketplace, using multiplication for our bulk transactions. And we did all of this with Roman numerals, adding and subtracting, sometimes multiplying, and we began to all deeply hate the number system's clumsiness, which was his intent, right? So we traveled back to ancient India, and he talked about Brahmi numerals and Al-Khwarizmi's writings about them and how they fascinated Fibonacci, eventually replacing Roman numerals in Europe, and we adopted them into our marketplace. and the number system became fluid and predictable and fast. I was fascinated by these stories of mathematicians who were fascinated by numbers. Why did they care so much about them? How did they invent new systems? How were they able to travel the world to learn about all of these things and take back these ideas and translate them for other cultures? And I asked Mr. Hart all of these questions alongside all of my peers, and he said, I love this question, let's find out together. And we spent several more weeks together in third grade talking about the world's number systems and their trade-offs. And so I left third grade with a sense that my questions were valid, that the world of calculation, rich with history and culture, and that Mr. Hart cared deeply about my curiosity and everybody else's in the class. So a year later, when I was 9, my mother, a fifth grade teacher, became enamored with computers too. She was obsessed with the idea that they could be a place for play and productivity, and she saved up buying our family an Apple IIe. She didn't have a particular vision for what we would do with it. Instead, she believed in a vision that it might be useful for something, and it was delivered after school one day in, I think, 2 or 3 big cardboard boxes. And before she got home, I did, and I dragged in those big boxes in from our porch, fascinated by it. I tore open the boxes, I started putting things together based on the instructions inside, and by the time she was home, I had it on the floor with all of its floppy disks installed, and I'd found this word processor and this strange home simulation game called Little Computer People. This is an illustration of what happened when she came home. She was not angry with me for opening this box and putting it together. She came into the living room and said, well, what do you notice? And she sat with my brother and I for hours that day. And I showed her what I'd found and what I didn't understand. And we tinkered with it and learned together, seeing what it could and couldn't do. And that evening at dinner, my mind was spinning. Well, what could it do? Could I make it do things? What couldn't it do? I knew that day that it didn't really matter what I wondered about it, what I asked, or what I wanted to learn. My mother, as a teacher, would be there whenever I went, wherever I went, learning with me. So a few years later, I was 13 in 1993. We had just replaced our IIe with an Apple LC2, and on it was HyperCard. My brother and I, here's my brother shown here with a graph of interconnected HyperCard screens, would often draw for hours, making weird art for each other, using the zooming features to create these creepy, claustrophobic mazes with the kind of hostile rules only close siblings would make for each other, testing each other's will. One day I noticed that the images we could make could be linked together, and this opened up this whole new world of possibilities. I showed my brother, and we started plotting together this epic interconnected world that went deep down into dark caves of the earth, where the strangest creatures lived, and I'll only let you out of their dungeons if you could solve their riddles. This simple abstraction became elaborate webs of inside jokes, where my brother and I would reference and meta-reference until finally we brought our friends into these worlds, and we lost ourselves in linked cycles of interactive narrative absurdity. Our learning with each other here was not for a purpose. It was not productive. We created with and for each other as an expression of love through making, humor, and interactive documents. The fact that I learned about what a graph was and what nodes and edges were, that was incidental, right? What mattered is that my brother reciprocated a kind of unconditional acceptance of my computational expression, and that I did the same for him. That same year, I started pre-algebra, and my teacher in math, Mr. Ryland, had us buy the Texas Instruments 82 graphing calculator shown here. And by then, I was really fascinated by computers, and a portable computer that looked remarkably like my beloved Game Boy was a dream come true. The first day of 7th grade with a computer in my pocket, that was amazing. And so a classmate had an older brother that had a version of Tetris on it. And I ordered a link cable through mail order, and a month later it arrived. And I transferred his brother's version of Tetris onto my calculator, only to learn that it was extremely slow. You could watch pixels erase line by line and then be rendered the line below. So it was functionally Tetris, but it was not experientially Tetris. But I was still excited, and so I shared it. I looked at everything that I could find about it, and I spent weeks trying to understand how the game was built, pressing the F5 button to see all of its source code, reading and rereading chapter 5 of the instruction manual, which happened to be basically a textbook on the TI basic programming language, and eventually found that the text console rendered a lot faster than the graph. And so I rewrote the rendering engine to use letters and punctuation as Tetris pieces instead of pixels, and it was so much faster. I was so excited. I shared it with everybody in my math class, and everyone was playing Tetris on their calculators instead of learning pre-algebra. It was a classroom management disaster for Mr. Ryland, but also suddenly a game party, and the best way that I could imagine spending 7th grade together. And so my teacher stopped the class, and rather than scold me or confiscate our calculators, he said, "That is so cool. Whoever made this, teach me how you did it after class, and let's teach everyone else." And so I stayed after lunch period that day and showed him what I'd done, and he told me how proud of me he was for learning, for sharing, for teaching him. And we spent many lunches after that together, learning about the rest of the calculator's functionality and programming language. And he brought that learning into our math education. And so I spent the rest of the year with pride that my curiosity about a Tetris game on a calculator was valid in school, valid in math, and valid wherever it might take me after that. A few years later in 1996, I was a high school sophomore struggling in physics. I was not understanding Newtonian mechanics, and I was on track for a B. And I learned enough about programming, including some Pascal, that was installed on one of the abandoned computers in our school library, that I decided to try to make sense of momentum and mass by making a simulation for myself. So I toiled away each morning in the computer lab on our 286 Intel PCs, and eventually made some balls bounce into each other on a single axis, trying to preserve their momentum. And it was this really fun way of doing algebra, especially because I'd made the background flash wildly every time the balls collided. And so Mr. Kugler, shown here, smashed between those two colliding balls in my simulation and some Pascal keywords, walked in one morning in the library and saw my simulation, and he said, "That's so cool. What is that?" he said. And I meekly told him about struggling with momentum and trying to make sense of it with collisions. And he said, "I've always wanted to make simulations for this physics class. If you show me you did this, how about I help you with the algebra part?" And we spent the next 2 months at lunch talking about programming and physics and simulations. And he asked me about my aspirations and helped me see the many possibilities in science and software engineering and research. And I left that class just not having figured out physics, but with a sense that Mr. Kugler wanted me to find my way in the world, wherever it might take me. A year later, in 1997, I was a junior in calculus. I'd gotten very interested in creating virtual worlds with organic shapes. I wanted to create interactive digital art that captured fractals and liquids, and all the books I'd read on 3D graphics used triangles, which were far too angular for all of those things I wanted to make. Ellipses felt way more organic, and so I started rendering ellipses in 3D space to try to make those pictures. The problem was, on those ancient Intel 286 computers, drawing ellipses was super slow, and I'd figured out an algorithm to render them using the formula I'd learned in geometry, but it used a lot of square roots, and the roots that were the thing that seemed to be slowing down all of that rendering. And so I asked my teacher after class one day, Mrs. Hudson, here portrayed against the whiteboard, if she knew of a fast way to calculate square roots. And she said, "That is a fascinating question. I have no idea what you're talking about, but I know who to ask. Let's find out together." And it turned out I had no idea that she had a PhD from Texas A&M. And so she wrote her former PhD advisor, and he mailed this 90-year-old book from interlibrary loan from MIT, which was full of all kinds of weird manual algorithms for computing approximate roots. But it was in this archaic pre-standard math notation. And so she sat with me for school for weeks, translating the chapter into standard math notation, and then I translated that math into an algorithm with her. My ellipses rendered 100 times faster, and I spent the rest of the summer cleaning spills at my summer grocery store job, making weird organic 3D art with ellipses for my teachers and friends. I knew that it didn't matter what it was or why I made it, only that it was me who was making it, and whoever I shared it with would value it because of that. Now, it took me a long time to understand the series of experiences, for how they shaped me, for how it was my own interests that drove them, and how I had parents and siblings and teachers that met me where I was at and wherever I was going, for how a certain kind of love was at the center of all of these. And it was the love that made each of them push myself forward further wherever I wanted to go. And in many ways, this love in learning and of learning was what saved me. It created a space of safety, of affirmation, of care. I was able to build a sense of self-worth around computing, to compensate for the complete lack of self-worth I had for myself in most other ways. But it was also a story of privilege, of well-prepared teachers with time to respond to my interests and to support me individually, of a school that had computers instead of didn't having them, and a mother who was a great teacher and curious about computers herself. This was not the experience of most children in the 1980s or the 1990s, and it is no accident that I am here on this stage with a PhD in the position of power that I hold. This moment is, all of these moments, this talk itself is an outcome of a consistent, uninterrupted sequence of unconditional love, support, interest development, and opportunity that easily overcame the loss and the grief and turmoil in all of the other aspects of my life. So before we get to part two, I want you to take a minute to reflect on your own experience of love in education. Turn to your neighbor. Did you have love in your computer science education? Who gave it to you? How did it impact you? Was it related to computing or something else? And if not, why not? Take a minute and then we'll come back together. All right, let's come back together. Can I get the mic? All right, let's come back together. I'm sure you all have much more to say. These are life stories to share, right? So as we move forward throughout this talk, be thinking about those experiences as we talk about the rest of the ideas here. And let's move on to part two. So what is love in learning? Theorizing about this is not new, and I'm not the first person to talk about it. But I want to make sure we talk about what love can mean before we talk about what kind of love I mean. So let's take a moment and be precise about this. So as I mentioned before, I am not talking about romantic love or sexual love. I am also not talking about love and religion as it's conceptualized, for example, in Christianity, Islam, or other faiths or forms of worship as a kind of submission to a deity. So set that one aside as well. Love of this kind may very well have an important place in your life and even in your teaching, but today I'm speaking in strictly secular terms. We also can't talk about love without first acknowledging the impact of Greek philosophers on Western conceptions of love. The Greeks had so many kinds of love that they talked about, but there's a few that I find relevant to learning. And Canadian psychologists back in the 1970s, John Allen Lee, organized them into several types. One is agape. This one is a more universal kind of love of all. It has some roots in the love of God and God's loves for human beings. This shows up in education in the way that we talk about learners as all having inherent value and deserving of our attention. Another is storge, a kind of familial love like that of a parent. This affection might show up between that of a teacher and a student who cares for and values a learner. A third is xenia, a kind of generosity towards newcomers and foreigners. This shows up in how we welcome students from across the globe into our classrooms, whether refugees or immigrants. And then there's philia, a kind of loyalty, community, and equality, a collectivist love. This shows up in the way we come together, for example, at this conference to think about how to support the learning of all of the students that we have in our communities. And then there's philatia, or love of self. It is hard for a teacher to be loving in many ways if they do not love themselves and give themselves compassion. Social psychologists like Tim Lomas have recently examined descriptions of love across language and culture beyond these Greek roots and found that these seem to be robust across cultures, but there were also other kinds of love that they found missing from Western civilization, like sebomai, a kind of reverential worshiping love, which sometimes students give to respected teachers that many of you might have received from students. But of course, the Greeks and psychologists, they don't own conceptions of love. Education scholars like John Dewey, Paulo Freire, spoke of love implicitly as a kind of agency and freedom that people have to exercise their interests and curiosity. There are also counseling psychologists like Carl Rogers, who wrote about the necessary and sufficient conditions for therapeutic relationships. One, a caregiver's unconditional positive regard. Two, an empathetic understanding of someone's internal frame of reference. And three, the explicit communication of this understanding to that person that you are caring for. And then there's Bell Hooks, who wrote on both love and learning and teaching, and how we often devaluate it. She wrote that, taught to believe that the mind, not the heart, is the seat of learning, many of us believe that to speak of love with any emotional intensity means we will be perceived as weak and irrational. Maybe you're feeling that right now about this talk. So these ideas from education and psychology and sociology and feminism, they show that love and teaching might be about perspective taking and acceptance. And they also mirror studies of parents' desires around how teachers relate to their students that show that parents want more than care from teachers for their children. They want a kind of professional love to be complementary to the love of parenting, about a student's mind and growth and wellness. But my favorite recent work on love in learning is a theoretical paper on love in education by Igor Jasinski and Tyson Lewis from 2016, about 10 years ago. Tyson is an art teacher and art education researcher in North Texas. He and Igor wrote about the inherently problematic ideas of love in learning shown here. One, tough love. Many of you have probably heard of that. It's a kind of stern love that loves a student for what they will become and not who they are or who they want to become. I will love you if you learn C++. Reciprocal love, a kind of transactional love in which teachers love a student for how the student transforms the teacher themselves. Your passion for generative AI inspires my research. An identified love, one in which teachers love a student for their identity as it is right now, but in a way that positions identity as static and precluding change. I'm so proud of you for becoming such an excellent theorem prover, right? Who you are now. So Jasinski and Lewis argue that all three of these show up in education in fundamentally conditional ways. They're offered only on the basis of a learner achieving, behaving, or being in a particular way. And so they extend that argument by saying that the only kind of love that truly respects students' agency, dignity, and capacity for change is a whatever love, shown here as this yellow smiley face. Whatever love loves the students for whoever they are, for their ever-evolving positionality, and for whatever transformations that might entail or come along in their lives. You can also think of this as, I love you because you are you, and not more or less you, because you don't or do like computing. But I also love you for whatever skills and talents and interests you might grow in the future, whether those have to do with computing or not. My positive regard for you is unconditional, and I will walk with you wherever you go, whoever you become. It is this idea of love that felt most true to the kind of love that I felt from my mother, my brother, my teachers. Each of them said to me, I love you for who you are now, interested in floppy disks and dungeon trolls and Tetris and animation and square roots. But I also love you for whoever you will become, whether it is a computer science major, a PhD student, a professor, a late blooming woman, learning to love herself. Who you are now is enough, and who you are later will be too. And so this idea of whatever love, it doesn't say much about the scope of whatever. For that, I think we have to go back to scholars like Bell Hooks, but also the many other branches of scholarship on identity. This bright yellow heart that I'll use to represent whatever love throughout the rest of this talk can come in many shapes and sizes. It can be anti-racist, working with youth to imagine worlds that dismantle all of the racial hierarchies in society, in computing or outside in the broader world. It can be feminist, working with youth to imagine worlds that dismantle gender hierarchies in society. It can be gender affirming, working with youth to imagine worlds that respect the beautiful natural diversity of sex, gender, gender identity, and gender expression. It can be ability affirming, working with youth with disabilities to imagine worlds that respect the beautiful diversity of ways that we communicate, think, and move throughout the world. It can be class aware, working with youth to imagine worlds where economic power does not dictate their life's possibilities. And it can be culturally affirming, working with youth to imagine worlds where the diversity of languages and beliefs and traditions is an asset in learning and not a liability. Because all of these aspects of identity can shift and change over someone's lifetime and shape our learning across our lifetimes, a whatever love embraces all of these dimensions, but also all of the ways that they can change. It's fundamentally unconditional and focused on learning, identity, and transformation. And so, one more time, before we return to computer science, let's return to you. Turn to a different neighbor. Did you have a whatever love in your computing education or in your education in general? We'll come back in a minute. All right, let's come back together. Once again, I know you have much more to say. Hold on to those stories for the rest of this week as we end and go through this conference. I want to turn briefly to part 3 of this talk, which is really linking these ideas of whatever love to computing and computing education and all of its ideas. And I want to argue that whatever love and the ideas of computing are in great tension, and that's a tension that we have to resolve as a community. So let's start by observing that most of us are teachers in this room, or instructional designers, or education researchers, and many of us stand up in rooms like in this photo here, in front of a group of students who are trapped in a chair listening to us talk, just like right now, where you're trapped in chairs listening to me talk. And so as I talk about the ideas in computing, I want you to think about how love shows up in how you teach those ideas, or how you research teaching about them, and ask yourself, does it center a whatever love or something else? So one conflict between whatever love and computing is at the foundation of binary and discrete logic. Take Claude Shannon's idea that every message we might send is reducible to bits with a prescribed meaning. This is an idea that disregards that messages are contextual and situated and momentary. It rejects the idea that messages we send each other, the documents we create, are contextual, framing them as an abstract kind of document devoid of any humanity, just a rational form of numbers. To digitize, then, is to destroy and perhaps even dehumanize, erasing the importance of all of that social context and the inherent indescribability of human communication. This is not a whatever love. It is an erasure of positionality, of speaker, of meaning. Whatever love is also in tension with the data structures we talk about when we teach. Here, this structure encodes gender, race, ability, nationality as a sequence of bits, starting from the premise that every idea, that everything we might want to remember in a digital store can be categorized and classified and delineated and structured, even expressed. This disregards all of the ways that our memories and identities are constantly remade by our experiences, by our remembering, that even the structure of how we organize our self-conceptions can be reshaped by cultural change. Data structures, in contrast, harden the things for what they are now, how they are structured now, but do not easily allow for transformation, especially of the structures themselves. I know this because I've spent hundreds of hours trying to change my name, for example, across thousands of databases whose data and schemas I cannot edit, and who even have engineers who can't edit them. This is not a whatever love. This is an erasure of agency. Algorithms fare no better. The premise of an algorithm is that every meaningful action in the world is sufficiently reducible to a series of steps, or deterministic or probabilistic. This algorithm visualization of decisions and passes and lists and operations entraps our actions in a world into structures, processes, and procedures that we do not shape and do not reflect the diversity of human action. This is not a whatever love. It is an erasure of human action's true nature as emotionally guided, fallible reason. And our latest meaning for artificial intelligence, what are we on now? This is like the 9th definition of AI. The billion parameter convolutional neural networks poses its own fraught tensions. We train them on data that is a record of the past, that was never meant to determine our future. The plausible output generative AI produces has started to become our reality, creating fake news, fake citations, fake programs, fake writing, fake images, fake realities. This is not a whatever love. It is a rejection of reality and the ideas that culture and language and ideas and our identities are in our minds and not in our recorded histories. And that language embeddings they imply really have nothing to do with those realities. Overall, computing is a medium for archiving brittle, reductive models of human experience, identity, and action for normalizing that action. It is a box in which we place ourselves, where the love we give each other is increasingly a resistance to its confines, where we try to make the box large enough to contain humanity's multitudes, but where people on its edges are crushed. Computing is a medium that is therefore fundamentally anti-positional. It leaves no room for loving people for who they are or who they might become. Instead, it is designed to lock us into structures, into history, and into rules that someone else has deemed normal or likely. That we use computing to uncritically shape our world and experiences is to constrain and harden what we are, individually and collectively, creating friction in our transformation and our liberation. This is not a whatever love, or any other kind of love that I know of. It is a prison. And then there's computing education itself. I sometimes think of education systems as boxes of their own kind. A home, a schoolhouse, a college building. These are boxes in which our dominant form of computing education has been captured by a political economy of colonization, of profit, of exploitation and greed, displacement and replacement and policing. Our goals are not to see people's humanity and help it flourish, but to mold students into the right shape of cog to be shoved into the machinery of Amazon, Google, Microsoft, Meta, Apple, or somewhere else. Companies and even not-for-profits fight to replace the creativity of a teacher's whatever love classroom with uniformity, chasing scale over relevant, responsive, and sustaining learning. We talk of computing education as a pipeline fueling profit in industry, as if students are an ancient oil to be pressured through tubes at high speed, as opposed to unique individuals with many possible futures, and agency and dreams that go beyond whatever network of channels our institutions have constructed. And then rather than see cheating as a symptom of a failed system of credentialing and gatekeeping and inequity, we position ourselves as police, detecting and punishing students trapped in the cracks of these inhuman structures in our institutions, often ones that we design ourselves through assessments and policies that force immoral choices on the part of students for their own survival. And so when students come to us with who they are and who they want to become in sociology or art or politics or history, we react not with an invitation into computing and partnership to transform computing to realize their dreams, but with a dismissal. If that is who you are and that is what you want, you don't belong here. And rather than celebrate the diversity of students' values, whether they be justice or community, fairness or humor, respect or wisdom, we indoctrinate students on a narrow set of antisocial values of efficiency, domination, wealth, or disruption. And so students come to see our education systems as upside down, as if computing has nothing to do with the rest of human experience and find themselves only to be or become who they are outside of their halls. It is not a whatever love, it is exile. Now, I know most of you aspire to a more loving computing education. And I've talked with you in the hallways. I've heard you struggle with the systems that we have, that we maintain, that we have built, and the tensions between those and the values that you hold. I know you want better, but often don't know how to get there. And I am not going to pretend to have the answers myself, because I've had those same struggles and I've made those same challenging choices at the expense of our students' well-being. So in my teaching and in my administrative work, and even in my research, I have created all of these boxes, shun students' interests, diminish things that they would become. And in response to that, I've learned from others. And so in part 4 of this talk, I want to show you examples of people and places I think are realizing whatever love in computing education and what they might have to teach us about how to do it and what they've taught me. So one of these places is the Kapoor Center down in Oakland, California, this 2-story building here in downtown Oakland. A few years ago, they synthesized some of the best scholarship on what it means to be responsive to students in computer science learning, creating a plain language guide for learning called the Culturally Responsive Sustaining Computer Science Education Framework. I think many of its ideas are compatible with realizing whatever love. So here are 2. Student voice, student agency, and self-determination are valued, encouraged, and incorporated during the CS learning process. Student ideas and input are actively solicited from students to co-create classroom instruction. Families and communities and their cultures and assets are incorporated into the design of CS curricula, classrooms, and learning opportunities. Families and community members are inherently sought out and included in the construction of CS classroom learning and activities. This is a framework that redistributes power back to learners and to their communities, rather than centralizing it in a teacher or a curriculum or a tool. It's one that centers students' positionalities instead of the concepts and skills of computing, which are present, but are necessarily subordinate to the agency of students in the classroom. Another person who inspires me is our colleague Rick Rose-Roquet at the University of Colorado Boulder in the information school there. Over the past few years, she's examined joy, what it is in the context of computing education and what its relationship to learning is. And she finds in her work that to create spaces where families and children come together to create with computing, that joy is not a single emotion, but a tapestry of them, and more than anything, an aesthetic for learning. She writes, emotion is typically marginalized in traditional computing spaces. Instead, reason is prioritized over emotion, abstract over the concrete. In education literature, emotions are often positioned as something that supports other learning outcomes, but emotional transformation can be the end goal too. In family creative learning, joy is the aesthetic of the experience. Not joy as positivity or happiness, but joy from transformation that emerges from the challenges and struggles they encounter as they create. She is arguing here that joy is one thing that brings together laughter and confusion and food and connection and surprise, that these are ultimately the precondition for learning spaces that are grounded in whatever love and solidarity. I also want to elevate the work of Kylie Pepler, a professor at the University of California, Irvine in informatics. She's long examined the relationship between STEM education and arts education. One of her recent papers, Tools and Materials as Non-Neutral Actors in STEAM Education, struck me as a really powerful culmination of some of her inquiry. She finds that toolkits that privilege feminine or artistic elements significantly impacted learning more than traditional toolkits used in schools, which showed little to no significant learning gains. And she continues in this paper, the materials used in classrooms are not read as neutral, despite efforts to design for neutrality. Youth with different backgrounds, experiences, preferences, and latent stereotypes will read and identify with materials in different ways. By diversifying the tools and materials we teach with, we have new ways to concretize challenging concepts, as well as invite participation and signal the diversity, variation, and complexity of STEM content. And so this finding shows that the computational media we use, the programming languages we choose, the tools that we choose, they are not incidental. They speak to learners about whose knowledge and tools are for and whether or not they are included in that group. I am fortunate to work with a wonderful human teacher and scholar, Jane Everson, one of my current senior PhD students, soon to graduate, and now full-time at the philanthropic not-for-profit Foundry 10. I speak about her work not to elevate my own work with her, but because she and her visions have transformed how I think about my own teaching in relation to joy and love. And I think Jane, I would argue, is one of the most radically student-centered teacher scholars that I know. Whatever happens in her classroom is a product of what students want and need to happen in that classroom, informed but not dictated by her expertise. It also shows up in her research. For example, in her recent ICER paper last year, Dreaming of Difference, she and my other excellent student, Roden Landesman, asked adolescents, what do you need computer science to be? And youth said quite clearly, they need agency, but accountability from teachers. They want their whole selves, their whole communities, and their relationships in and outside the classroom to be valued. They want learning to be relevant to their lives and interests. They want to be seen as complex individuals with far more than just an interest in computing, but also the bridges between computing and their other selves. And she ends the paper, building trust comes from creating learning spaces and practices so that students feel they've been heard and are excited to enroll in classes where educators are attuned to the needs to make impact both within and outside the classroom. In order to build trust with students so that they can do critical work that matters, we need to listen to them and acknowledge that their desires when it comes to CS education. This is a whatever love. I love who you are, who you will become in whatever way that does or does not connect to computer science. And then Mara Kadarni, one of my recently graduated PhD students, also inspires me. Their dissertation ended with a study of a class they taught in computer science at the University of Washington. It was no typical class. It invited students to come together to talk about what they were told CS is, what CS was to them, and what they need computer science to be in higher education. Here's a revealing quote from some of Mara's interviews about the class. Honestly, the more I reflect on my identity and how I relate to my identity in computing, I realize that I've almost separated the two completely in my mind. Computing is my future career, but when I think about what makes me who I am, I think of my hobbies, my friends, my family, and my likes and dislikes, what I do in my free time, not what I do for work. Mara concludes, students whose personal narratives fail to fit within computing's disciplinary narratives fragmented their identity. Its fragmentation was in their best interest. This fragmentation was maintained as participants experienced that their positional identity and their personal narratives were largely absent from coursework, leading them to struggle to find community in computing, lose their voice, become jaded about their future, and flatten themselves to survive disciplinary spaces. For those that desired a more unified self, the identity work of reconciling disciplinary and positional identities could be fostered through safe, trusting, and vulnerable disciplinary spaces. I'll end this part of the talk with one more person who inspires me, and that is my teacher partner, Adrienne Gifford, a middle school computer science teacher outside of Seattle. She is more than anything a courageous, bold, and curious teacher, always willing to reinvent her practices to find new ways to youth. And we have been collaborating on elevating students' language and cultural assets in computer science learning. And I've learned so much in my collaboration with her that educational programming languages have to be intricately designed to account for all of those assets. That students who are fluent in languages other than English have so much to share that is left out of CS, that the cultural roots of ideas in computing, such as binary English ideas of truth values embedded in George Boole's conceptions of truth, are rich contexts to catalyze learning. And so this simple act, centering instead youth's evolving positionalities around language and culture and creativity, this is the kind of whatever love that I see Adrienne express daily in her teaching. So what does this mean for us? Let's reflect forward for a bit, and then I'll take questions. These quotes from bell hooks echo in my mind. The vast majority of professors lacked basic communication skills. They were not self-actualized, and they often used the classroom to enact rituals of control that were about domination and the unjust exercise of power. In these settings, I learned a lot about the kind of teacher I did not want to become. To teach in a manner that respects and cares for the souls of our students is essential if we are to provide the necessary conditions where learning can most deeply and intimately begin. These sentiments that are fundamentally about the central importance of unconditional whatever love in teaching, a love that centers identity and positionality, are about observing that respect and care do not happen without love. And the deepest of learning that does not happen without a whatever love for what our students might become. She observes that none of us is in a position to love our students if we cannot love ourselves or even be kind to ourselves, and that our institutions and our pedagogies and our practices of control are an outgrowth of the love that we did not have. So what does this mean for us? I think the examples I shared show some pedagogies that reflect this love, but I think more than method or pedagogy, the implications are first for ourselves and are potentially fuzzy, forming whatever love hearts. As I noted before, I have not had a lot of love in my life from others or even from myself, and I've never particularly wanted to control my students, but I have also never particularly had the capacity to love them. I had to learn to love myself before I could give them the whatever love they needed to thrive. And that was a long journey for me of not only accepting my gender identity, but also processing the immense amount of other pain and trauma from my childhood and adulthood, including that I experienced in school. That meant therapy and tears and disorientation and rejection and loss. But as I found enough peace in myself, even amidst a pandemic and ongoing cruelty and hate in the world, I've begun to learn to nurture and grow my capacity for that love in learning and bring it into my teaching. And in doing that, I've learned that in my teaching, I replicate the relationships that I have with myself. When I loathe myself, internalizing the world's loathing of me, I projected that loathing onto others. And when I love myself, I began to love others for who they were. Your journeys are probably going to be different. In fact, there are many kinds of whatever love that you might give in computing education and many ways to become the person who can give it. Perhaps it's therapy, perhaps it's faith, perhaps it's just reflection and action. And so rather than give advice, I give you the questions that I asked for myself in the hopes that you find different answers. Who do you teach for? Who do you grade for? Who do you want your students to become, if anything? Who will you become as a teacher? What is the role of your emotions in your learning and teaching? What is the role of your students' emotions? What is your relationship to yourself, and how does that show up in your relationships with your students? And for those of you who are researchers, I have bigger questions. When is computing amenable to whatever love, and what parts are not? Is being culturally responsive and relevant and sustaining also being loving, or are they different? Can generative AI ever be loving? In what context? Can computing be a tool of whatever love? What is the impact of whatever love on CS learning? What is the impact of whatever love on our computational society more broadly? And what does doing research on whatever love entail? And so I won't pretend that answering these questions or realizing a loving computing education is enough to part the dark clouds behind us. Far from it, I think centering love, even just in computing education, may invite more hate. Love can be seen as a kind of weakness by the authoritarian politics of this moment. It can be seen as abandoning rigor and merit, as embracing the feminine, which history shows is a path to disregard and dismissal. It can be seen as weakness to target for those who love power more than people. But I do think that however we do this, the specific kind of whatever love and teaching and learning we might create is a vision that we can fight for. And a vision that, if we realize, is enough to transform our computational future and perhaps our political futures as well. And so whoever you are at this moment and whoever you will be this week and into the future, I can't wait to find out who you'll become and how you'll transform your teaching and your scholarship. I look forward to rebuilding our institutions from this fascist rubble and to all of the transformations that it will enable. Thanks. There's microphones on the side. If you're already standing, you can just walk over.
Hi, Amy. This is Stacy Branham from University of California, Irvine. I just want to thank you from the bottom of my heart for putting a heart on every slide at a keynote at a computer science education conference. I feel, as a woman in computing, that I feel seen. Thank you. My question for you is, how do you respond to faculty colleagues who, well-meaning, say, I can't fit any of that love into my computer science class because we're already filled to the brim with the technical content, and I can't get my students prepared for the next class if we change things?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'll try to keep the answer brief. That is fundamentally a viewpoint that says that it is more important to squeeze those students into a box than to let those students be who they are and travel the path that they're going to travel. So if they don't believe that respecting their humanity and all of the possibilities of where they might go is more important than fitting them into that box, then that is just a fundamental difference in values. And that's a conversation to have about in your broader faculty. What is our curriculum for? Where are we sending students? Why? What is all of this for? And I think this moment, as our institutions of K-12 and higher education are under attack and maybe having to question what our priorities are, that's the perfect moment to have that conversation.
Thank you. And I also want to add, who are we creating to lead the technology companies of the future? Who are, I don't want them to be axing DEIA programs.
That should be central to that conversation.
We're
right?
creating whole humans.
Thanks.
Dale Reed, University of Illinois, Chicago. Thank you for your talk. It's wonderful. I've been learning, well, I love being efficient. And I've been learning recently, I was challenged that efficiency can be the enemy of love. And in computer science, I want to design an algorithm that's really efficient. And I want my students to learn as much as possible. So can you comment on this struggle between efficiency and love?
Yeah, there's a phrase that artificial intelligence researchers have co-opted from HCI, human in the loop, right? It's like they're trying to reinvent HCI from this. But I think this is really central to thinking about what does efficiency mean in algorithms? Usually it means taking a human out of the loop, right? To get something to be computed as fast as possible. And I think there's always a question whenever we come up with an algorithm, what are we doing when we take people out of that process that we're trying to automate? What does it mean to slow down that process? When is there actually value in making it so slow that human beings have to take in information, make a decision in partnership with an algorithm? And that might mean that things are actually thousands of times slower than they were before. It's a very counterintuitive idea when we've been trying to teach computation for more than 80 years, fundamentally about taking people out of the loop. And so I think that's the core question to ask about every algorithm is when is it justified for it to be completely divorced of human input? Because speed is not the only important factor in the decisions that algorithms make on our behalf.
Thank you.
Hi, Austin Corey Bard of the University of Delaware. First, wonderful, wonderful talk, very thought-provoking with a lot left for me to think about. I'm struggling with an element of it, and I feel like I am not well-versed in this literature and I have some reading to do to try and understand better. But one of the elements you talk about is tough love, and my take is that you reject it. And I'm trying to reconcile this, and I hope you might have some insight into it. During the pandemic, I was trying to embrace more of the radical vulnerability, and I don't think I did particularly well. I struggled with it. But afterwards, I went back to a lot of policies that I would describe previously as draconian, establishing firmer deadlines and having less flexibility and saying, no, I'm sorry, but it's the end of the semester and I can't accept this anymore. You've failed my class. And on the one hand, it does hurt. I take no pleasure from any of this, but establishing more of that control, making them put away their phones, making them put away their laptops. Many students come back to me and appreciate these policies, it seems. Maybe it's because it's what they're comfortable with, but it seems to make a better learning environment for me. Sometimes it feels like being firm and in control is not a bad thing and it's my job. And I'm not good at it, but I try. Do you reconcile this? Are these different things? This is not tough love. Is this something else? Or am I doing the bad thing?
I think it is tough love, but I think that we can disentangle where it comes from, right? Why are we doing it? Most of the time, I would argue that when we're doing that kind of tough love around deadlines and assessments and grades, all of those summative features of our systems of learning, What we're really doing is trying to help people be incentivized to develop strong self-regulated learning skills, to be on time, to focus, to balance their responsibilities accordingly. And there are so many other ways of teaching those skills other than failing people from a class and having them drop out of college, right? I have a student, for example, right now who's really struggling with some of those skills. And it's just meant that I spend more time in office hours helping that student figure out how to organize their homework assignments, how to set aside time to study, how to remember and do the prospective memory planning of what are the responsibilities they have for the future, how do they balance their time, how do they time box things. That's important learning too. And I think that we can compare that, right? The direct instruction and scaffolding and mentorship of self-regulated learning versus a harsh punishment that derails their learning in higher education, and figure out which one of those is more effective at helping somebody thrive in school. And I think it's probably the latter.
Hi, Shomir Wilson, Penn State. First of all, thank you so much for this talk. This was a sort of a pep talk for higher education that I don't know if I knew I needed. Probably a lot of folks might not have. My question is about a sort of a tension that I experienced thinking about some of the objects of that you love that you discuss. So I think a lot about my love of my work as a professor. Got tenure 2 years ago, and that's continuing to be great. But at the same time, I have to acknowledge that universities are not perfect institutions, and they sometimes do bad things to people, and the power structures can be criticized. So any thoughts on resolving that tension? Thinking, gee, this is such an awesome job. I'm able to do such great things for other people, but knowing how I got to this point, well, maybe not that so much as what I'm building upon is imperfect.
Yeah, absolutely. The systems that we have, right? They are coming from centuries of building upon a foundation that maybe doesn't reflect some of the values that we talked about in this talk. I tend to think about all of the people who've been calling for us to burn all of it down for 50 years. And now having a federal government in this country burning it down for us. What will we do to rebuild it now that they've done that work for us, right? I think this is a wonderful moment for us to think about what are the things that we haven't liked about the system that we might change about it? Are there ways that we can structure it differently and create something that's more equitable in the process of rebuilding? So I don't think these opportunities come along very often, but this is the moment for us to do that thinking and planning. And this is the community to really do that work for computer science education.
Thanks.
I know we are at time, and I have a session to chair in 20 minutes, the ACM Transactions in Computing Education first session, if you want to come to it. But I want to pass it off to the program chairs to close things out, and I'll see you in the hallways.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. Coe, for your presentation. I'm sure you'll have a chance to reach out to her when you're out in the sessions and out in the hallways. So we hope that your time at the 2026 SIGCSE Technical Symposium will be well spent. We hope that what you gain here will have a positive impact on your teaching, your research, and your students' success. So thank you again for joining us this morning. The exhibit hall, which is one level below us, will soon be open for you to visit with our exhibitors, and there will be some coffee and snacks for you to enjoy. Have a great symposium, and this concludes our opening plenary. Thank you.